Is Nick Gillespie of Reason, and this is the Reason live stream that we do every Thursday at 1 p.m. Eastern Time. I am joined by my colleague and co-host, Zach Weissmueller.
Hello.
Hi, Zach. How you doing?
Good. How are you?
I'm very good, thanks. And we are joined today by a very special guest, Eli Lake, a national security reporter, and and goes beyond that, who's been harshly critical of the broad topic that we're talking about today, which has to do with the Durham report and the investigation into the collusion or so-called collusion between the Donald Trump presidency and the 2016 election, of Donald Trump and Russia. Eli has also recently written very critically of the FBI, which is front and center in all of this. So we're going to dissect the Durham report, talk about what the main findings were, what played out, what it says about politics in the current moment, but especially about the FBI and law enforcement and intelligence in the country, and what we should be doing next. So, Eli, thanks for joining.
It's great to be here, Nick. Thanks for having me.
Let's start.
And you, Zach.
Hey.
Yeah. Zach,
and the
Zach
entire Reason magazine family.
Yeah, he's Zach is the bad cop, so it's good that that you say nice things. So you won't by the end of it. He's going to be all over you like a pit bull on a Girl Scout. But let's start talking about the Durham report, which was an investigation into the FBI's investigation into possible collusion between the Donald Trump campaign and Russia. What do you think is the core takeaway from the Durham report?
Well, I think the core takeaway is that the people who were leading the FBI when in the 2016 election, which had investigations into both Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump, that leadership team, starting with Jim Comey and his deputy Andrew McCabe, were not honest, good cops. They were bad cops. They were fundamentally people of low character. They were willing to not only deceive the public, but they were willing to keep information from the elements of the FBI and the legal system in general, such as the surveillance court and parts of the Justice Department, that would somehow, undermine their case against, or their theory of a case that they could never prove about Donald Trump. Saying that does not mean that you think that Donald Trump is a good president, or that he should be elected, or that there weren't things that Donald Trump said about Russia that were unpresidential and bad, and that there were, or even that there, you can say that and say, well, on the outside, I thought there were things that didn't add up in 2016, and maybe Trump looks suspicious. But the FBI had so much information, and they were collecting so much exculpatory information in the course of this investigation, and yet they continued it. The other thing I would say is that I think it also shows that the real abuse of power was, I think that it was wrongly opened, and I think that John Durham makes a very good case that they didn't have anything when they opened it in the end of July of 2016, the investigation known as Crossfire Hurricane. But the real abuse was after Trump improbably wins the 2016 election, and that's when you really see the FBI doing all kinds of things to try to extend this investigation into a sitting and elected president when they had nothing. And again, I mean, it's a testament to the failure of the leadership of the FBI. And that I would just point out that one of the things about this report is that John Durham makes very few actual recommendations. And in part, he justifies that. I don't have it in front of me, so I'm not going to quote it verbatim, but he basically says, if we have leaders of the FBI and you have people in responsible positions of the FBI that don't adhere to the motto of fidelity, bravery, and integrity, well, then it doesn't matter what I recommend. It doesn't matter what the org chart looks like. It doesn't matter what new procedures we might put in place. If you have people of low moral character in these positions, then there's nothing we can do. That's a damning thing to say. Yeah. Because every one of these reports, including other damning reports about the FBI's conduct in this investigation, such as the Inspector General's report, Michael Hart, they all include at the end we need to have these new procedures. We need to do this, and maybe as if there's something you could fix in the process. But sometimes you just need to sort of say, no, you had bad people who were making bad decisions, who were dishonest, and this is what happened. And let's make sure that we don't put in bad people in these really responsible positions. Sounds like kind of obvious thing that almost anyone could know, but it's rare to see that in one of these kind of reports.
We're going to get to
Yeah.
possible reforms. Durham doesn't make them, but we can talk about what should happen to the FBI, and then also, and on a bigger picture level, how should the American people, kind of respond to this? Like, what should we be thinking about, and what should we be demanding of our government, as well as sub parts of that, like the FBI, going forward? Just as a quick starting point before we get into a lot of the specifics here, you say, this shows that James Comey was, had it in for Donald Trump, or was acting unprofessionally. Going through the 2016 election, the rhetoric and the narrative that persists is that Comey ruined the election. He tossed the election to Trump because he screwed over Hillary Clinton on a nonsense investigation. Can you just dispatch that very quickly?
Sure. Well, first of all, let's grant the part of that narrative that's true. 11 days before the election, Jim Comey announced the reopening of the email probe. And then we should always remember that 2 days before the election, he then announced that it was closed again. And that in the beginning of July of 2016, he announced that no reasonable prosecutor would bring charges against Hillary Clinton, but what she did was really bad and was, I think, she very reckless. His point was with her email system. Now, that was something that there was going to have to be something. I mean, it was well known the FBI was looking into it, but it's the FBI, it's not like the FBI just opened it out of, I mean, this was part of originally a congressional investigation that started with Benghazi, and then because of Gawker, it was discovered.
I just want to interrupt you to say, when you mentioned Benghazi, I feel like Lawrence Harvey in the Manchurian Candidate. Like, suddenly I was triggered, and Benghazi is this term, or this signifier. We don't talk about it anymore, but there was a multi-year period where it seemed that every other word out of every other political figure and pundit was Benghazi. But please continue.
No, that's for those who don't remember.
You're lucky.
It's when the U.S. consulate in Libya was overrun by a group of terrorists, and the response from the Obama administration initially was that it was a social media flash mob that got out of hand in response to a movie on YouTube about the Prophet Muhammad. Anyway, so Gawker at first published emails that were taken by this hacker that went by the name of Guccifer 2.0, that from Sidney Blumenthal. Okay, so those then revealed that Clinton had a private email address that apparently she was using when she was the Secretary of State. Congress gets all over this. They subpoena all of this stuff. Hillary Clinton's tech, who was running this private homebrew server, then deletes a bunch of back emails. It later was determined that it was not nefarious, or at least the FBI determined that he didn't do it for any bad reasons. But so then there were this question of, well, we subpoenaed all of your archives because you were the Secretary of State using a private email server, but then somebody deleted it. So then it becomes like, well, did you obstruct our investigation? Now, this is all happening in Congress, but FBI doesn't really have much of a choice. It has to sort of look into it, especially since, and people made this point at the time, if you were using a private email server and you were, I don't know, like a mid-level State Department or mid-level Defense Department person, you probably would be at the very least fired, and there may even be litigate. You might face criminal penalties, because there are strict rules about what kind of information you're allowed to put on unencrypted systems and so forth. So there's a whole question or a lingering scandal about Hillary Clinton that has nothing to do with what the FBI says or doesn't say. That is before the 2016 election season, really, and sort of going into it. And it looks like it's going to be the main Republican attack line, which is, was the Secretary of State using a private, unprotected email system to basically, communicate sensitive or classified information. And that was what the FBI was basically looking at. And what the FBI said was, well, there's a good chance that foreign governments may have gotten a hold of it, but no reasonable prosecutor would really prosecute Hillary Clinton. So in some ways, you could argue that the initial press conference from Comey was a good thing for Hillary Clinton. If you remember, the first response from Trump at the time was to attack James Comey and to say they were compromised. On the other hand, the press conference was a little bit of a split at the baby approach, because Hillary Clinton was nonetheless criticized for her private email server. I would just say one thing at this point. I am somebody who believes that there's way too much emphasis on protecting too many secrets in the U.S. government. And at the time, I didn't think it was something that ought to have disqualified Hillary Clinton from running, and especially since she'd already gotten the nomination from her party. So I didn't think that an FBI investigation or a Justice Department prosecution was warranted that would have basically negated the choice of the Democratic Party for their nomination that year. But it's not like the FBI or people who were bringing up as a criticism of Hillary Clinton her use of this private email server, this line, but her emails, right? It's not like they were making a mountain out of a molehill. I mean, it was a fair criticism in my view.
Yeah.
Why did she use this private email server? But so that's the background of this. That's the argument for why the FBI sabotaged her. But what we learn from the Durham report is that there were several investigations. I should say I think there were 3 separate investigations that were started in some way. And they weren't even full investigations, but there was information that was coming in that looked at foreign governments trying to influence Hillary Clinton or her campaign. In 2 of those cases, Hillary received what's known as a defensive briefing. So she was told, we've picked up this information, be on the lookout for any donations from country X. In one of these investigations, there was the field office had asked for surveillance warrants, and they never applied for those surveillance warrants because headquarters basically didn't act on the request. And then there were separately, in addition to all of that, there were 3 field office investigations by the beginning of 2016 into the Clinton Foundation. That is a big charitable organization that the Clintons set up, and they would solicit donations not only from big corporations but from foreign governments, even when Hillary Clinton was the Secretary of State or when she was a senator. And so some of this was based on Peter Schweizer's book called Clinton Cash. Peter Schweizer, the criticism of the left is that Peter Schweizer is a partisan, but that doesn't mean everything that he wrote was wrong. And also it was one thing, one strand in a investigation. Anyway, Andrew McCabe slow rolled the Clinton Foundation investigations in 2016. What did he do? He tried to consolidate them into one field office. He told them no overt investigative steps without my approval. That was basically hamstringing them. Then there was, in addition to that, there was a phone call from Jim Comey's office telling to cease and desist the investigation altogether based on an unidentified counterintelligence tip. All of this is in the Durham report. All of it is fairly new. And I should say it relates to something else, which is that Andrew McCabe was just chastised for lying to investigators in a leak investigation. So this is the Inspector General's report, or another Inspector General report. And what he did was he leaked, he's talked to the Wall Street Journal about a story about these Clinton Foundation investigations and made it seem like basically basically put this on the Justice Department, saying the Justice Department didn't want to do anything about it, trying to obscure his own role in slowing it down. And why is that important? Because his wife ran for statewide office, or I guess for a state delegate office in Virginia, and had received money from Terry McAuliffe, who's close to the Clintons. So there was potentially a sort of conflict of interest for the deputy FBI director and all of this. But I would say that he specifically really chastised by the Inspector General for lying about talking to the Wall Street Journal, claiming he didn't, and then pinning it on an underling who he had instructed. So he was basically shoving it off on someone who was lower in the pecking order than he was. And, he didn't really face any consequences for that. We don't want to go down this, so we don't have to get into why, but
we're going to get into McCabe in a second.
But my point is that like, all of this stuff is relevant. And so what Durham concludes with this is that there were two standards for opening investigations and dealing with investigations into the two campaigns, which is, if for the Clinton stuff, you know that there was, you know, they did everything they could to keep it from becoming a new investigation, and they slow rolled stuff. And for Trump, if you look at what ultimately was the reason for opening this huge investigation, it's a joke. It is a joke. And it's really important that we make this clear to everybody, that the initial reason for this investigation, which was a memo from the Australian ambassador and some other Australian diplomats to the U.S. embassy, which then goes to the FBI, was not information. It was pure like speculation. And finally, after all of these years, we actually see the relevant, what's called paragraph 5, the part of the Australian cable that's relevant to the opening of Crossfire Hurricane. And you could read it for yourself. It's there's no information. It says there was a suggestion from this a junior campaign volunteer named George Papadopoulos, not a senior figure, somebody who just happened to be in a wine bar with Australian diplomats, and they're having a random conversation. And then the Australians then report this after the news of the hack of the DNC emails comes out.
Right.
He doesn't say, we know that the Russians are going to hack, you know, the emails from Democrats. He doesn't say anything like that. He just simply says there's a lot of baggage that Hillary has, and we have a lot of stuff. I think we're going to win. You know, the Russians might do something. And so the information is conveyed as a suggestion that the Russians might. It's like a suggestion of a suggestion. Right. It doesn't. There's no specifics, no mention of emails, no mention of whether Trump knew anything about it or anybody else in the campaign knew anything about it. And so, if what Durham basically is saying is, if that's all you had, why didn't you check with the Russia analysts in the FBI? Why don't you check with the other people in the intelligence community? Why didn't you interview the diplomats? Why didn't you interview George Papadopoulos? Why didn't you do all of these things before opening a full investigation in the middle of an election of the Republican nominee, the Republican campaign? Why would, and he says that's like, it's like crazy to think that was the reason why they launched it.
But the Australians they send the memo after the leak of the DNC. Is
Correct.
That right?
That's right.
Okay. So they're kind of putting it together and saying, oh, this must be what George Papadopoulos was talking about.
Correct. But then what Durham says is that, and because he interviews everybody, the reason it took so long is he did all of the work. He did the work. He read his bell hooks.
He's an ally.
Yeah, he's an ally, right? So he interviewed Alexander Downer, the ambassador in London, and he said he didn't remember anything about emails. He didn't remember anything about whether or not George Papadopoulos said that Trump knew about it or was willing to. Yeah. So that's the one thing. And the second thing is, and I found this amazing because I always thought there had to be something more to it. So he looked throughout the entire U.S. government, State Department, CIA, NSA. He had the full access, and he wanted to find out, was there anything in your holdings, meaning had you collected any information that would have supported the theory that Trump was in a collusory relationship with Russia, or his campaign was? And they had nothing. Not the FBI, not the State Department, no one in the the vast U.S. intelligence community, for which Russia has been, if not the number one target, the number two target for the last 70 years. So we're talking about like trillions of dollars worth of, like, you know, over the years of collection infrastructure aimed at, you know, one target or one of a few targets. Nothing. They had nothing.
Yep.
It was just a cable that was based on a suggestion of a suggestion. Now, if you're to tell me that you still think it was okay for the FBI to launch, I mean, again, it's not like they launched, this is not an investigation into some rando, and it doesn't matter. It really matters if you, and then, by the way, because it's a full investigation as opposed to what he said would have been a preliminary investigation, or even or an assessment. So there's all these other steps that we're learning about that you do in the FBI. It means that they can send confidential human sources, snitches. They can send moles into meeting with people for the Trump campaign to try to solicit information from them, you know, where they surreptitiously, where they don't know they're talking to somebody who's going to go right to the FBI. They do that. And then what do they get back? They get back, I don't know what you're talking about. We're not talking to any Russians.
Yeah.
We'd never take
So
their
not
email.
only was the investigation started on the flimsiest of pretexts, it did not yield. It was a bad hunch.
Not only was it a bad hunch, the only information that the FBI gets that would confirm this initial suspicion from this one cable, well, it's the Steele dossier.
Right.
Which we now
is
know
Oppo research on Trump that essentially its origins were with the Hillary Clinton campaign.
She paid for it. Yes.
Yeah. So that you have,
and by the way,
the
they lied
FBI
about it.
Yeah.
They lied about it to the FEC, and they lied about it to and the lawyer Mark Elias lied about it for 8 months.
Zach, what do you want to say?
I mean, this new information that's come forth in the report that you referenced with regards to the slow rolling of investigations into the Clinton Foundation, or these foreign donations that either in one case was not investigated at all, the other, this defensive briefing was given. It raises the question for a lot of people, including someone in our audience who will bring up here, of whether this is political bias. Rex Sauls asks, does the Durham report give credence to the FBI whistleblowers about bias against conservatives in government? On the other hand, there was the Inspector General's report that said there were problems with the investigation, but there was no evidence of political bias. And if we look at what McCabe said,
no, that's not what the Inspector General said.
Okay, could you please?
What the Inspector General said is that he didn't find evidence of it.
Yes,
but he didn't clear them of it, because he also said,
okay,
I can't.
That's what I said.
That the explanation for all of these errors, particularly when he's talking about the FISA process, doesn't wash. So he didn't find like another explanation for why all the errors went in one direction against Trump.
Right. But
what he found was he didn't have a smoking gun. He didn't have an interview with somebody where they said, well, you know, I'm a Democrat and I just really loved Hillary Clinton, and so I did all this stuff. So he didn't get that, but he didn't get anything that made sense to him that could explain why they made so many errors in the same direction. And like, then you add that to what Durham has discovered, where there were all these things they didn't consider. There are all these lines of investigation that they didn't even try. So like there were people who were lower down in the FBI, for example. This is a very important point. And this wasn't, by the way, in the Horowitz report. He didn't get into this. There were people lower down that said, because the Steele dossier was taken extremely seriously by the FBI, not just for the FISA court. There is a kind of little rhetorical maneuver that has been done by some of the dead enders on Russiagate, which is to try to suggest that the Steele dossier was very insignificant to the overall investigation. Actually, it was really important to the investigation.
Yeah.
So there were people. This is when we have the Mueller report. There were FBI agents who were looking at it, and they said, we should start an investigation into someone named Charles Dolan. Charles Dolan is a longtime Clinton ally who was at the time an unregistered foreign agent for Russia, who Durham says is probably responsible is the origin of the P-tape lie, as well as other things that ended up in the dossier. And also he charged the subsource, the main collector in the dossier, a guy named Igor Danchenko, which I hope we can talk about in a little bit, with lying about his relationship with Dolan. He was acquitted of those 5 counts of lying, by the way, but we should just say, so the FBI guys wanted to investigate Charles Dolan because he was somebody who it looks like who had contributed to the Steele dossier, who clearly wasn't a Russian official. That's not intelligence. He's a spin doctor that is actually working for the Russians. So, and a big time Democrat. Okay. And then that was, and the leadership of the Mueller team said, no, we're not going to investigate him.
Yeah.
So it raises this, why, you didn't pursue any leads that weren't part of the, theory that Trump and his campaign colluded. You ignored evidence, and you didn't share the evidence with the right people that were as exculpatory on that. And even after you got dead end after dead end, you kept this investigation going. So those are like, so in the answer to the question, was it politicized? It may not have been politicized in the sense of everybody at the at the FBI. I mean, like, I think Peter Strzok, for many years, as was Comey, voted for Republicans. So it wasn't like a Republicans versus Democrats or something like that, but it was certainly politicized against Trump.
Yeah,
it was certainly like people had an anti-Trump bias. That's for sure.
What I'm trying to understand better is the motivations of the key decision makers, and you can kind of start to see some of it when you look in detail at the reports. Like I pulled this section from. This is the portion where they're talking about the investigation into an illegal foreign donation to the Clinton campaign from some unnamed foreign government. And this is where they gave a defensive briefing to Hillary's team and said, hey, we're looking into this. And this is what McCabe had to say about it, according to Durham. He said that when we take defensive briefings, or when we do defensive briefings, we have to take into account whether it will eliminate or reduce your ability to get to the bottom of the threat. Another assistant director for counterintelligence said that because the possibility existed that someone on the Trump campaign could have already taken the Russians up on their offer, I thought it was wise to open an investigation to look into the situation, and that presumably a defensive briefing would undermine that investigation. So, and then later on, Durham raises the point, well, wouldn't that logic equally
also
apply
work for
to
Clinton?
the Clinton campaign?
But does it? Can I ask?
Yeah,
sure.
Oh, I was just going to say, Zach and Eli, the difference here is that Hillary Clinton was the Secretary of State, and she had been a U.S. Senator, and she had credibility. I mean, she had worked in the government, et cetera. Yeah, whereas Donald Trump was a kind of loose cannon. Nobody really knew what he was talking about. His son had said various things. He had said various things. I mean, I'm playing devil's advocate here. Yeah, like Trump has a long history of payouts and lawsuits, et cetera, and shady business dealings. I could see why I would be like, I'm not going to tell Trump we're looking into this, because he's going to immediately, react in a way that would destroy evidence. Is that not a legitimate?
I would agree with you if this was like another political figure, if it was like Frank Church or something. It's Hillary Clinton, and I'm not trying to be difficult. What I'm trying to say is, we know from lots of things that the Clinton Foundation had all kinds of pay-for-play operations going on.
So
I mean,
your argument,
my argument is that I don't see any evidence that like Clinton would somehow. I mean, I agree with you. Yeah, she was Secretary of State, and I'm not necessarily accusing her of anything. But Bill Clinton gave lots of speeches for, six figures, I think, fees.
To
like Russian banks, to Kazakhstan.
Okay, but so your argument is not that they should have given a defensive briefing to Trump. It's that they should not have given a defensive briefing.
My argument is that there's a double standard. There's a double standard. Okay.
Okay. Fair enough.
Because I could argue it the other way too, which is to say that, like, well, I mean, I agree that, like, if you just were looking at what Trump was saying, particularly about Russia and his behavior in general, it raised certain flags when he sort of couldn't answer the question straight about whether he thought NATO was a good idea and things like that.
Yeah.
But we don't live in a country where you are cast under suspicion. Or investigated because of an opinion that you bring into the debate, no matter how out of left field it is. It is not elite. That's, in fact, undermines our democratic process. I mean, we have had a so-called consensus. I am a believer in the consensus, by the way, that NATO is good and Russia's a rogue actor and really bad or whatever. Trump disagreed. He's running for president. It's like for the voters to decide, basically. But you can't say, I'm not going to give him a defensive briefing because of things that he's legally protected to say under the First Amendment and are part of our democratic process.
Right. Okay. Fair enough. The other thing that I wanted to bring up, when this is going on, by this point, has the DNC emails been hacked and released? Because that also seems to feed into it. It's not directly relevant to Hillary's email servers and stuff, but that seemed to be, or it was very quickly talked about as a function of Russian interference into the election. That Guccifer had 2.0 had hacked the emails, and that
Right.
they really showed a rotten element in the DNC that, among other things, besides the fact of being hacked and looking like idiots, that the DNC was really working to throw the primary process to Hillary Clinton. Does that have any bearing on any of this stuff?
Well, they were. I don't
Yeah.
know that you needed. I mean, there's an argument that that's kind of like what political parties, tend to also. I mean, this is the first time this has happened, so sometimes the left makes it seem like a bigger scandal than it really is.
Right.
But certainly Hillary had her allies in the DNC. But I mean, that happens a lot, where there's an insider candidate who's going to have that kind of advantage.
Right.
The second thing I would say is that it was the hack of the Podesta emails. Did reveal some extraordinary things, such as the internal correspondence on the Clinton Foundation.
Right.
Yeah, it was the Clinton Foundation, where Chelsea Clinton was saying, "I can't believe you guys are, you're such gonifs. What are you doing?
Yeah.
You're charging it you're double booking and charging all this stuff." And Clinton was clearly, there were all kinds of kind of paybacks involved, which is supposed to be the sort of charitable stuff. And there was a really devastating couple emails on that. And then there was another hack of her speeches that she gave to Goldman Sachs that Bernie Sanders was all talking about. Now, I think this gets into a really important point that has been missed. In the first part of the 2000 teens up to probably 2016, it was totally normal for journalists to use hacked materials if there was a public interest value. Classic example would be Cablegate from WikiLeaks.
Right.
But we saw this with there was a great kind of victory for remember there was the climate change emails that were that showed the corruption of, so there were all kinds of stories like that, and nobody sort of said, you couldn't print that, or releasing that information was really bad because it was hacked by somebody, even though it was. And
no, as long as it was true.
As long as it was true, right? Exactly.
Yeah,
right.
come on. Why are we talking about how we got it? These are meaningful documents. Yeah.
So so the Russians did hack these emails and this information, but it was true, and some of it was news. Now that standard changes after the 2016 election. Again, I could argue it both ways. Maybe it was good that it changed. Okay, but you can't hold the Trump people to account for playing by the standards that everybody played by in 2016, that then changes after the 2016 election.
Right.
So oftentimes now, I mean, I look at this as I call them the Russiagate dead enders, whatever you want to say. But what they're doing is what's known as retconning. They started with this idea that that Trump colluded with Russia. It didn't pan out. Mueller didn't find any evidence of it. So they're now clinging to other pieces of information, saying, no. See, this adds up to that. Yeah. And so that part about it, Roger Stone was trying to get the emails. From WikiLeaks. Are you surprised? Yeah. Of course he was.
And that doesn't have anything to do ultimately with the facts that we know them. This is the broader context of a lot of this stuff is, that Russiagate has emerged as, the idea that the Trump campaign and the Russian government, or elements in the Russian government and elements in the Trump campaign, were colluding in a way that was nefarious, real, and effective. And it's just, there is no evidence for any of that, but people are acting as if it still is in play, despite
they're acting as if it's true, if it was obviously true, right? And that you are denying reality if you insist on that these reports or whatever say it's not true.
Let's look at the Zach. Let's pull up the McCabe clips, because McCabe is Andrew McCabe, the deputy director of the FBI, is really a point person. And Eli, we want you to look at these clips and then kind of react.
Yeah, I should. Can I just make a quick plug? My podcast, The Reeducation.
Yes,
I hope you subscribe to. Nick has been a guest twice for some classic episodes.
That have nothing to do about politics, by the way.
Right.
It's like John Lennon and
punk rock.
Yeah. So maybe
some of our best
politics. But at any, I'm sorry.
But my latest episode is just about Andrew McCabe, and the fact that he's still
That's
working
one
for
of the
CNN.
reasons that we're having
Yeah.
you on here. Your coverage of this, but yeah,
So, I
check
mean,
out
this-
Eli's
Yeah.
30-minute monologue, kind of a documentary, an essay, a kind of, Andrew McCabe, you are a horrible human being. It's much more profound than that. But let's look at these McCabe clips, and then Eli, tell us what you're thinking.
Yeah,
this is like a political version of Two Girls, One Cup. This is going to be a response video.
Just to set these up, the first clip is from 2019. So this is after McCabe has been dismissed from the FBI, and he is on a book tour. And I think he's having conversation with Anderson Cooper, and I think it reveals a little bit of his mindset, the mindset of the people at the very top of the investigation, about how they were thinking about this, how this was going to play out. So Adam, go ahead and play that clip for us.
Not just one, not just two, but numerous people in and around the president, in and around the campaign, maintained contacts with individuals from Russia, people connected to the Russian intelligence services. You have a number who have been charged, a number who've been already convicted and pled guilty for all kinds of different offenses.
Do you still believe the president could be a Russian asset?
I think it's possible. I think that's why we started our investigation, and I'm really anxious to see where Director Mueller concludes that.
And then this next clip is just from last week. So clearly his belief that Trump might have been a Russian asset in early 2019 has not been borne out whatsoever. But now he's being asked on CNN about his reaction to the Durham report as someone who's named in it hundreds of times.
Let's talk about it with CNN senior law enforcement analyst Andy McCabe. He's the former deputy director of the FBI. And importantly, he oversaw what became known as a crossfire hurricane probe into Trump in 2016. John Durham says that you shouldn't have launched it. What's your response?
John Durham is wrong. And it's not just me that says that. Every other entity that's investigated our activities in 2016 agrees. And that's, of course, as you mentioned, the DOJ Inspector General, Michael Horowitz, as well as the Senate Intelligence Committee, led, of course, at the time by a Republican. So this report, Poppy, stands as an anomaly.
So, Eli, what's your reaction to now CNN's senior legal analyst, Andrew McCabe's assertion that this is just an outlier and everyone else says that the investigation was pretty much justified?
Well, and now let's turn, now that we're talking about the danger to children right now at clown parties, let's turn to our senior analyst, John Wayne Gacy. Tell us, what do you think about this new crackdown on child abuse? And are you serious? This is, I know we know it's there, but listen, let's first of all say the anomaly.
We've talked a lot about the revolving door from the intelligence agencies to cable news on previous streams. It's fairly disturbing, but putting that aside, what do you think of the substance of what he's saying there?
So first of all, we should just point out, Andrew McCabe did not elect to talk to John Durham, and yet he is here talking to CNN. So that's okay. If you really think it's all just a big persecution, that's a tell. Second of all, he's wrong. It's not an anomaly. Michael Horowitz's report in 2019 is devastating to the FBI. The FBI itself, in response to the Durham report, said we take it very seriously, and we've already put reforms in place, and the people who are responsible for this no longer work for us. So, I mean, I was paraphrasing there, but so the FBI itself doesn't think it's an anomaly. And I guess the other point is that, that first clip, he's making that in, late February 2019, he's talking to Anderson Cooper. We would learn in a few months that the Mueller team found no evidence of a Trump-Russia conspiracy. And then we would learn by the end of the year that the FBI had deceived and gamed the surveillance court, the FISA court, and that it wasn't an isolated incident. And, we would learn all kinds of other things about this investigation. So what the hell is the former FBI deputy director talking about when he says he thinks that the president of the United States might be a foreign agent, which is basically, I mean,
that is John Birch Society level
totally
invective with,
and it's from
it's just coming from the other direction.
And it's coming from the FBI, and there was no evidence, and he knew there was no evidence for it when he was making those remarks. There was no evidence when he was fired from the FBI of that. And the arrogance and the fact that it's like it's a kind of like listen, I don't go in for the disinformation talk that everyone's talking about. But if you want an example of disinformation, Andrew McCabe in his interview with Anderson Cooper, that's disinformation. Mm-hmm. And he knew better. That's the thing. It's like, listen, I forgive other analysts for saying in 2017, it looks like Trump has something to hide. I thought Trump had something to hide. When he fired Comey in the way he did, there was a lot of information the public didn't have. So, I mean, that happens, that, life, but the people at the FBI who are running the investigation, they have far more information than us, as it should be. So for them to then become like public pundits or something, and then use their positions to create a false kind of scandal or false crisis in American democracy, it's despicable. And it's unbelievable to me that he's still an analyst for CNN. How could you be on the journalism side of a news outlet as some sort of analyzing the news? He should be the target of a hostile interview. He should be like, Jake Tapper should do his whole thing. By the way, Jake Tapper is very good on the Durham report, I should say. I want to credit him for that. And there's a lot of, but when Jake Tapper was saying, I made a new rule, we're not going to have any Republicans on, they're going to lie about the 2020 election. Okay, great. Can we have a rule? We're not going to have anybody who's going to lie about the 2017 investigation into Trump, including our own senior law enforcement analyst. So I just find it incredible that he's still an analyst, and he's not the only one. I don't want to pick on Andrew McCabe. All of these people, and it's particularly true with CNN and really MSNBC. I mean, half their roster seems to be these former creeps.
Brennan.
Yeah,
it's to rebuild their credibility, I really would like to see an editorial policy go into place that you just don't hire former intel officials to be commentators for you. It doesn't. Well,
I should say, if you have on just a generic former senior FBI person as a news analyst, because I don't know, there was a terrorist attack or something.
Yeah.
I mean, that's fine. That person's going to have perspective on how investigations work. It's probably going to have some old contacts. It's when there is the story is the bad behavior from the FBI. You can't then have these people on as like news analysts.
Yeah,
it's the bad behaviors that they did.
Yeah, and you mentioned, I mean, the idea that the disinformation narrative kind of like flipping, and now it is the intel agents like putting out the disinformation to the American people. I mean, there is a very interesting little moment in the Durham report that I've pulled up here. You mentioned Igor Danchenko earlier, and what they say about him, who this is the subsource for the Steele dossier. And apparently Danchenko may have had some links to Russian intelligence services. The FBI had investigated him before and not really resolved that issue. And what Durham says about this is that in not resolving Danchenko's status vis-a-vis the Russian intelligence services, it appears the FBI never gave appropriate consideration to the possibility that the intelligence Danchenko was providing to Steele, which again, according to Danchenko himself, made up a significant majority of the information in the Steele dossier reports, was in whole or in part Russian disinformation. So there's a very disturbing irony there that for all the talk of Russian disinformation, the most impactful piece might have been purveyed by the FBI. I mean, what was your reaction to reading that section of the report?
Well, I mean, or the Clinton campaign in this case.
The Clinton campaign kind of filtered it to the FBI. Yeah.
Can't make it up. I mean, hilarious.
Right.
it's not, by the way, that's not even the worst of it. I mean, Christopher Steele himself, as well as the firm that hired him, Fusion GPS, were working for Russian oligarch Oleg Deripaska. Oleg Deripaska is the aluminum magnate, bad guy. But Oleg Deripaska is the big connection that is always talked about in context of Paul Manafort, who was also a bad guy, who was briefly for like 2 months, he was the campaign manager for the Trump campaign. Well, here's like Steele, who is presenting himself as this, former British spy who's, trying to stop the Russians and doing whatever he can, had a side deal working with Deripaska to try to retrieve money that was owed to him by Paul Manafort. So, I mean, one would think that the FBI ought to know that, and that would then affect the credibility of the dossier, and they wouldn't submit it as evidence in a FISA warrant application for Carter Page. But again, that's just part of this whole pattern that Durham exposed, which is that all these steps that you think would be obvious that they would take to try to confirm information and all kinds of things like that, they didn't take. So again, there's so many errors that at a certain point, from my perspective, it's no longer a question of, wow, you're such an incompetent boobs. Like it's like, I think that was corrupt. At a certain point, there's too many mistakes, right?
And they're always going in the same direction.
Always in the same
having
direction.
said this, and we've talked about this in different contexts, Eli, both separately and together, but the longer you look at the history of the FBI, and when you read something like Tim Weiner's book or the Beverly Gage biography of J. Edgar Hoover, I actually am more drawn to the to the hypothesis or the thesis that the FBI is simply not a corrupt organization, a fundamentally incompetent one. But we're going to get to that more in a second of what do we do with the FBI after this. Let's talk a little bit about how Trump intersects with all of this, both in terms of his behavior that made a lot of people wonder what the fuck is going on, but also his reaction to the Durham report. And I do want to point out just very quickly that John Durham, to me, it's ironic that he is investigating Crossfire Hurricane, because that sounds to me like a Doobie Brothers song, and he looks like he could be the third bassist in a touring
Crossfire
Doobie
Hurricane's
Brothers
the
band.
lyric from a Rolling Stones.
I know that, but I think it's a
Jumpin'
Doobie
Jack
Brothers
Flash.
thing. Yes.
Yeah,
but
he does look like he could be a Doobie Brother, or like Dr. Hook in the Medicine Show.
Yeah, something like that, or playing at a local bar in a Blues Brother cover band. Let's Zach, cue up the Trump clips that you want to run.
Oh, okay. Oh, sorry. Okay, so this first one is just generally this is one piece of evidence that people point to say, well, Trump kind of had it coming. He, in fact, openly colluded, like, regardless of how these investigations turned out, we have evidence on tape that he openly colluded. And
here is the smoking gun.
Here's the smoking gun.
Trump,
this is the evidence.
He wasn't behind closed doors. It was open that Trump invited and demanded that Russia collude. And Eli, in your wonderful most recent episode of The Re-Education, you talk about how a great journalist like Jonathan Rauch points to this or says Trump on occasions openly invited the Russians to meddle in the election. This is the clip that we're talking about. Let's run this thing.
What do I have to get involved with Putin for? I have nothing to do with Putin. I've never spoken to him. I don't know anything about him other than he will respect me. He doesn't respect our president. And if it is Russia, which is probably not, nobody knows who it is, but if it is Russia, it's really bad for a different reason, because it shows how little respect they have for our country when they would hack into a major party and get everything. But it would be interesting to see. I will tell you this. Russia, if you're listening, I hope you're able to find the 30,000 emails that are missing. I think you will probably be rewarded mightily by our press.
Was that collusion?
The dead to rights. Get him in an orange jumpsuit. Frog march him out. That's it. You know, where's the Justice Department?
Yeah.
We've cracked the code.
Mhm.
Really? Really? Have you never seen this guy before? I mean, it's just like he's a nightclub comedian who happened to be like, I mean, this is all like his patter in some ways. And it seems to me, I mean, maybe I'm wrong, but I interpreted that as saying, I don't have anything to do with the Russians. By the way, that was wrong. When he said that, his fixer, Mike Cohen, was trying to arrange a deal that never happened to build a Trump Tower in Moscow. Okay. And then he says, you know, it would be really bad if it was the Russians, because it shows how little respect, which is true. It does show how little respect they have for the United States. And then, you know, he's then talking about the missing emails that was the kind of prevailing narrative at the time, which was, well, what if she deleted all these emails and they didn't charge the tech or anybody else, and like, isn't that unfair? And you know,
And
lock
what
her
was
up.
in those emails that was so, you know, there must have been
Right.
something so devastating that they got rid of them, which
That's-
also is not clear, right?
Well, it's like that. If you want to, that it's kind of that's a little bit of an innuendo kind of attack
Right.
too. On the other hand, again, I look at it as a matter of sort of double standards. If somebody in the Trump campaign, even if it was a junior chipmunk like a George Papadopoulos, had deleted information that was subpoenaed by Congress, do you really think everybody would be like, oh, who cares? That's not a big deal. He didn't do it for corrupt reasons. So, but anyway, that's what he was getting at. He was like, well, you know, you can find them. And we now know, because of the Mueller report, that there really was, Trump was obsessed with finding those emails. So he contracted people to, you know, he asked Mike Flynn to go find them. And I think there were people who were willing to go try to get them from anyone, but that is not, and it doesn't have anything to do with what the Russians actually did. They hacked the DNC and they hacked John Podesta, and they gave it was separate emails. They're both emails, but it's different things.
Yeah.
And again, I don't think I'll ever convince David Frum or Jonathan Rauch or Lawfare or you know, Ben Wittes. I'm probably never going to convince them that this is like, what is this? Like, how is that count of anything? But they, I mean, to a certain extent, we also know, I mean, listen, when this started and people thought that Trump was going to get nailed by Mueller. So nobody said in those first 2.5 years of the Trump years, like, hey, they already got him. Look what he said in July 27th, 2016.
Right.
Like, it's right there on tape. Why don't we have to do any more investigating? That's collusion, everybody. No, they thought they were going to find, but, you know, was described in the Steele dossier, well-developed conspiracy, and like Paul Manafort and Michael Cohen in Prague and all this other stuff. None of it true. It was all.
You mentioned just briefly George Papadopoulos and Mike Flynn. Let's talk a little bit about the band of idiots that Trump surrounded himself with, or who were working for him, including Paul Manafort, who is a bad guy and was also a bad campaign manager, at least for Trump. He's in jail, but
No, he's not.
Papadopoulos.
He's not.
Oh,
He
I'm
was
sorry.
hard,
Okay,
yeah.
thank. He was convicted though.
He was not convicted for anything having to do with Russia. So a lot of people who got convicted, like Manafort's convicted because of
he's
not
a
paying his
sleazebag.
taxes, right,
Yeah,
and other things that have nothing to do with it.
Absolute sleazebag,
Yeah.
and a friend to autocrats, everywhere, as long in order to help them win fake elections, right? But somebody like George Papadopoulos, what does it say? I mean, is there any blame on Trump that he surrounded himself with a bunch of incompetents who were doing things like having the conversation that Papadopoulos had in Australia or with the Australians, or is that simply it wouldn't have mattered? I would have
maybe been more sympathetic to that point, but after looking at the actual memo and what the conversation was, I just don't. He was a young guy. He was a volunteer. This is really like he had another meeting with this professor named Mifsud, who was a Maltese guy who seemed to have connections to Russia. He's described as a Russian asset, he's connected to Russian intelligence in the Mueller report. It's interesting. He was interviewed once. He was never subpoenaed, sort of disappeared. We don't know what happened to him. I'm not saying he's dead. I'm just saying we haven't heard from him. And it's sort of this one weird loose end. But we also know that nothing came of whatever this theory about what Papadopoulos was into, because
then
what should have the FBI done in your mind under the circumstances where Papadopoulos, this low-level foreign policy advisor for Trump, meets with this weird, shady professor and then tells the Australian diplomats that there's some sort of Russian data dump coming or something.
No, he
and
didn't
then
say
the
that.
data
He
dump-
didn't say there was a Russian data dump. The point is, he said, I don't know, that the Russians might have something. It was a suggestion of a suggestion.
Yeah.
I have to get it in front of me. Let me see if I can find it. But
So the
the
suggestion
actual
comes out,
text
and
is
then-
really, really revealing, is my
Okay.
point.
Okay, so he makes some sort of suggestion. The Australian authorities report it right after the Russians do dump something. What would a more competent or less corrupt FBI do under those circumstances?
Well, I think we got into it a little bit before, but and I'm just basing this on one term. Check the rest of the intelligence community. Do you have any information to support this?
No.
Interview the Australian diplomats first to say, hey, what can you tell us more about this? This is fascinating. Maybe even interview George Papadopoulos. Why not? I mean, there's not. I mean, do they have anything like on him that suggests he's somehow dirty? Is he? So it's like, if he's not on your list, if you don't have any reason to think that he's somebody, and I don't think they did, why don't you just call him in and straight up ask him?
Yeah.
What about people like Mike Flynn?
Sure.
Okay, so Mike Flynn, who's going to be Trump's national security advisor, the denouement of his post-Trump appointment does not. I mean, he cuts a very disturbing figure right now. He seems to be either certifiably insane or just batshit crazy on some level. Did Mike Flynn bring problems to the Trump campaign by the way that he acted and the way that he talked?
Well, there is there was nothing other than the fact that Mike Flynn went, appeared on RT and got money from RT, and I think got money from like some other for speaking fee. Okay,
right.
You could have invested. In fact, the FBI did investigate this, and they found nothing, and they were ready to close the investigation, like before the end of the election. And the lead got. I mean, we have all that dead to rights. There was also, Mike Flynn had a lobbying contract, which is not uncommon. People who are advisors or surrogates in a campaign will have other kinds of influence contracts that they have. It's how people make money when they leave government. So he had another contract for a businessman who was a cutout for the Turkish government to defame Fethullah Gulen, who is a rival of President Erdogan.
Right.
Okay, so it's a sleazy contract that he had, and he had filed it under a looser law known as the Lobbying Disclosure Act, as opposed to the Foreign Agents Registration Act. That was fairly common before 2017 for people to do that if they were representing a think tank or a business, as opposed for a direct contract to a foreign government. And he was following the advice of his attorney. But and by the way, as soon as Trump wins and he was going to be the national security advisor, he ends the contract.
Right.
Maybe, there's a whole bunch of things he could have done. So that was all like interesting, I guess. And it was, I think, totally fair game for the media. Chuck Ross, I think, broke that story first. So all of that is like interesting. But there was no Russia connection with Flynn.
Yeah.
And the FBI knew there was no Russia connection. And then they tried to make it seem like maybe they missed something, because in the transition, he called the Russian ambassador, or the Russian ambassador tried to call him. And we never knew what this phone call was until 2020. So for a long time, people thought, well, they must have had a transcript. They overheard a phone call with the Russian ambassador, and it must have been so bad because that was enough to try to. Well, then we finally saw the transcript for this, and I recommend to anybody, you can find it online. Read it for yourself. Mike Flynn, that is exculpatory evidence. That is evidence he's not a Russian agent. That is evidence that you were right you should have closed the investigation, not what they ended up doing, which is saying this is evidence to keep the investigation open. And ultimately, because the Mueller, this is the thing, is that once a prosecutor kind of has you, in their crosshairs, they can get you to agree to something in order that you won't have to roll the dice and go to trial for something else and maybe go away. And they threatened his son, and he agreed to, these misstatements and so forth. And Then he withdrew his plea agreement, and ultimately the Trump administration correctly, the Justice Department correctly, after, by the way, an independent review. People get this wrong. It wasn't Bill Barr looked at it and said, he said, I would like someone neutral. So he gave it to another U.S. attorney, I think he was representing like Missouri at the time or something, to look at it. He looked at it and recommended, okay, you need to withdraw these charges. These were completely unfair. I wrote a big piece for commentary about it.
Right.
It's another just injustice in this entire investigation. Now, since then, Mike Flynn has said things about the 2020 election which are absolutely horrible, and nobody should, they're terrible. He's forwarded this, it's utter insanity, and it's really sinister, because it erodes confidence in our peaceful transfer of power. But then that gets to this other point. The FBI interfered in the peaceful transfer of our power after a free and fair election. It's a disgrace.
Yeah.
And yet it seems like there's a segment of our country that wants to put up these leaders and praise them as heroes of some sort of resistance.
Well, there's an interesting, and it's not quite symmetrical, but the right does not want to, or Republicans, conservatives don't want to concede certain elections. People like Carrie Lake are still carrying on. Donald Trump is carrying on. But then there's a version of that on the left. And these aren't exactly the same thing, but it's disturbing and fascinating. And it certainly is bad for the country when you have the two major parties filled with people who refuse to admit when they've lost elections. And that seems to be part of the, of the common language right now. Zach, do you want to?
Yeah, I'm curious, to that, building on that point, the way that Trump himself has reacted to the Durham report is worth talking about a little bit, I think, because he has a certain manner that he likes to frame things. We all remember, hoax, witch hunt, crime of the century, or the terms that he generally throws out there. And he was recently on Dan Bongino's show reacting to the Durham report. So let's just play that clip, and I'm curious to hear your thoughts, Eli, as to what Trump had to say.
This was a coup, and if I didn't fire Comey, probably you wouldn't have made it. I wouldn't have made it. This great administration that did so much wouldn't have made it, because Comey, this was a whole coup. They were ready to go in. If I didn't fire Comey, he would have walked in with Strzok and Page and this one and McCabe, and they would have said, sir, I'm sorry, but the Russia thing. I said, what Russia thing? Can you imagine if you would have been taken out of office for something that you never even heard about? These are bad people. These are sick people.
Was this an attempted coup?
That's over the top. I don't like, it's not a coup in the sense of there wasn't like a general who, got a group of officers to storm the White House. But it was certainly an outrageous kind of interference, as I said, in the transition, in the presidential transition. The FBI leadership's actions. Remember, in March of 2017, again, the FBI has zero evidence at this point. Comey tells the House Intelligence Committee there's an ongoing investigation of Trump and his campaign having to do with Russia, confirming, by the way, stories that were already leaked to the New York Times and the Washington Post and everybody else. Why would he do that? He mentions the investigation in 2016 initially in July in order to say he's not charging Clinton, also highly unusual. But why would he then bring up this in an open-ended investigation when, again, the FBI had nothing with the exception of the Steele dossier, which was disinformation? So, and the FBI, by the way, at that point knew that Danchenko was walking away from it. You can go through the list of all of the problems. They offered Steele $1 million so he could corroborate it, and he couldn't. So all of that information is somewhere. The CIA looked at it and said they thought it was junk and shouldn't be included in the intelligence assessment. So it's Comey out there who then says, I need to confirm this and everything like that. And by the way, it was such a moment, such a Watergate, West Wing drama moment. The FBI director is announcing an ongoing investigation into the sitting president. Holy Tahiti. And it confirmed so many of the priors of people who still bitter about the Trump winning that election. that we sort of stopped and we didn't really capture or examine what the hell is the FBI director doing?
Yeah.
Why would he make that announcement? And now we know there was no reason for him to make that announcement. We now know that what he said was, I mean, why would you say that? That it should have pretty much been closed at that point. So I wouldn't call it a coup, but I don't have much sympathy. And even though at the time, Trump couldn't have screwed up more about how he fired Comey and bragging to the Russian ambassador, the Russian foreign minister in the White House the next day about how he was crazy and everything like that. That was bad, but probably one of the best things that Trump did was getting rid of Jim Comey.
So in the time that we have left, let's talk about the FBI and how we go about that, and then how we deal with this larger question of things of how do we rebuild trust and confidence, not just in the FBI, but in the political process or in our culture. And just as to tee that off, the listener or the viewer, Colin, for $5, which you can do at YouTube, you can pay money and we'll always read your question. But he writes, we know the FBI is corrupt and DOJ is controlled by Biden. Why do we expect anything to change? Congress won't gut the entire federal government. Eli, can you, can we look at what Durham, you had mentioned this before, Durham does not come up with a series of reforms. Zach, do we have some language about what Durham, what he does kind of suggest in terms of reform for the...
He ultimately suggests appointing a career position for a nonpartisan FBI agent or lawyer to challenge FISA applications and every other stage of any investigation where it's a politically sensitive investigation. So that's the one recommendation that he makes. We also have, an appetite among Republicans. This is Representative Andy Biggs of Arizona, who's on the House Judiciary Committee, saying defund and dismantle the FBI, which honestly, I'm open-minded to just a wholesale, do we need to, is this agency even working at all anymore? But I'm curious what you think of...
And we'll also point out that Vivek Ramaswamy, who we interviewed a couple of weeks ago, was saying that. He said that, the FBI should just be dismantled because it is too far gone and rebuilt from the ground up, what that means. But yeah, Eli, what should happen specifically to the FBI in order to make it less prone to this kind of behavior and other types of recurring mistakes, it seems?
Well, the first thing is, I think you should separate the domestic intelligence function from the FBI from the law enforcement function. So I would take out all of the intelligence stuff that's in the FBI. It's a big part of the FBI. It's like Hoover built all that stuff in the 20th century against the Communist Party and the Soviets. It should go to something else, maybe a new agency, but it should not be under the same roof as the cops. Cops and spies should not coexist because spies break laws and rules and cops enforce them. So as a very basic point, we do not want the same people who are responsible for sort of countering intelligence threats or spying on potential terrorist cells in the same building as the people who are just there to, catch fraudsters and stuff like that. And
how did 9/11, how did the response to 9/11, including, the Patriot Act, but not limited to that, how did that, did that steroid up J. Edgar Hoover's initial conception of the intelligence gathering, and infiltration aspects of the FBI, or,
absolutely.
Are we worse off
no. It's a great point. So in a piece I wrote a few months back for Commentary Magazine, can there it is. Can the FBI be saved from itself, and can we be saved from the FBI? I get into the fact that I think it's been missing is that right before 9/11, the FBI came very close to kind of having the sorts of huge reforms that it so desperately needs, but it got out of that because Louis Freeh, who was the director, resigned in shame after Robert Hansen was caught, who went undetected for 20 years as originally a Soviet agent and then a Russian agent. And they sort of went after the
It's
wrong
nice
guy.
to see somebody who made a smooth transition from the Soviet to the Russian side of things.
Right.
It's only sad that he was an American FBI agent, but
Right. So that was a huge blow. But there were several other things. The Wenho Lee case was completely botched. They ended up having
could you
to.
briefly describe what the Wenho Lee case, because that was something that was everywhere for a while and then it disappeared, and it is a disturbing, personification of when the FBI gets something really wrong.
Yeah, sure. I mean, this is a guy who worked for one of the top secret DOE nuclear labs, and he was accused of being a spy for the Chinese, and the FBI was absolutely convinced of that. There were a number of, cases, stories that were written, I think, in major elite publications like the New York Times, accusing him of such. And then it ended up that they were totally wrong. And he sued the FBI and won because they defamed him. And even though I think they eventually charged him with something far less than being
it was like taking a classified or a secured computer home or something like that.
Yeah, but it was far less than whatever.
Nothing. Yeah,
right. But then there's the screw up at Waco. I mean, there's all kinds of things that happened in the 1990s that really were very bad for the FBI and its traditional friends on Capitol Hill. Usually Republicans like the FBI. So Chuck Grassley at the time, kind of gives a speech about
it was only in his 80s, so he was oddly vital,
a young spry spring chicken. Was like saying, hey, my daddy loved the FBI, but I at this point don't think I can trust them. And that was in 2000 or 2001 when he said that, and it's only kind of gotten worse. So what happened is, Free's gone, and then Bob Mueller comes in to be the FBI director. So once you have a new guy, you're not going to blame him for everything else. And then the FBI is kind of blamed for not connecting the dots on 9/11. Again, though, that's Louis Freeh's fault. It's not Bob Mueller's fault. He was only there like a week or two before 9/11 is his first day. And so the problem, what they said was that there were too many restrictions, and this is very important, that to the FISA, the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, and that's the system that the FBI uses to try to get the court to issue a warrant to spy on American citizens. And so they needed to remove those restrictions and knock down this wall between collecting intelligence and doing the law enforcement work, and which is what they thought that was the problem. What's rarely mentioned is that before 9/11, there were these FISA scandals, which produced all this outrage. The FISA court rebuked members of the for basically the same kind of thing that we saw with Carter Page. His FBI agents just totally making false BS statements to the court. They were ignoring those time limits on various surveillance warrants, so they were continuing to listen to lines when they shouldn't have, or even in some cases, they were continuing to collect information on phones after the number had gone to somebody else. I mean, all kinds of things like this that were violations of like what they were supposed to do and violations of the court oversight. It looked really bad for a while. It was the reason why we have something that's called the Woods procedure, which is that now allegedly for every FISA warrant that you submit to the court, you have to have a separate file at FBI that shows why every fact in that application documented is accurate. So you have to have, it's a sort of another one of these safeguards, another one of these reforms. But what did we learn from Horowitz? What we learned from Horowitz is that the FBI ignores the Woods procedures all the time. And that gets back to the main point of Durham, which is that if you have an institution that's filled with people who don't have integrity, then you can have all the reforms you want. It's not going to make a difference. So there has to be something that is also, in addition to, I think, removing the intelligence collection from the Bureau, which is a no-brainer. I mean, this is going to sound strange because normally I don't like the idea. I'm like Reason Magazine and many others, and I'm very aware I don't like cancel culture. But James Comey and Andrew McCabe and Peter Strzok and Lisa Page need to be canceled. That I don't want to send them to jail, but I think they need to be canceled. I think they need to be kind of like, banished from polite society. They should not be asked to, appear on prestigious think tank panels or to teach at universities or to appear as law enforcement analysts on CNN. And something like that would show that there are at least some sort of social consequences for FBI leaders who have fallen so far of the mark and have lacked so much integrity. And then maybe we have a chance at sort of trying to change what appears to be I'm worried about the culture of the FBI at this point, because it's not limited to just, I mean, listen, this is an egregious case, but we see it time and again, that oftentimes these G-men kind of think they're the law unto themselves, and we can't have that. So I'd like to see some social consequences for some of these folks.
I think another important aspect to point out here is that with the FISA courts being, one of the main avenues of abuse in this case and many other cases, there was an opportunity during the Trump administration to push for reform to the FISA Act, and that was on the table. Trump did not get behind that. There were some libertarian-leaning Republicans who were very much in favor of it. Trump, pretty much rubber stamped that going through. So at the top, you need someone who's serious about actually reining in these excesses, and also some sort of recognition if the part of the answer is to somehow separate, say, the law enforcement from intelligence and not mingle them so much in one like giant blob. Everything has been going in the opposite direction since 9/11, as you point out, because in that commentary piece, you make the very astute point that even though the FBI was somewhat blamed for intelligence failures there, the result was,
they were rewarded
more power. So these agencies just continue going in the wrong direction when these failures happen. And I don't know how you kind of flip the script on that, but that seems like an important aspect of turning this around.
Yeah. Can I ask, is there an appetite for reform? And, think about, like, we talk about the FISA courts as if, we don't even think about it anymore, but the whole FISA system was a response to investigations in the mid-'70s, widespread investigations that were horrifying, that showed that the NSA, the CIA, and the FBI were just completely uninterested in limits on their power and were engaged in all kinds of illegal surveillance and activity and whatnot. So you get the FISA courts, then they become the avenue of abuse to do more of that. You get 9/11, which then says, okay, you know what, we got to give them more power and less oversight in a profound way. And now we have, Russiagate, which at least in the news media and throughout, it seems like many in the Democratic Party are saying, what Russiagate shows is that we need, it's not that our internal investigation apparatuses are completely corrupt or false or dumb. They need more power because Trump got elected and he was colluding with Russia, so it's like it's a self kind of sustaining operation to just give more power to surveillance in the name of a free society, which is disturbing. But I wonder if we do get to a point, or Eli, could you talk about what is that point where the script starts to flip? I'm talking to you from LA, and I was driving around in the Showtime series with Michael Shanahan about Waco. The second season is coming out. And there was a version of this a couple years ago. Waco is, one of those major scandals in the 90s that showed the FBI was not very good at what it is always lionized for. All of the public relations, the FBI, there was a long-running TV show. Everything you hear about the FBI is the G-men are the goddamn fucking best people in the world. They are upright, they are Boy Scouts, they are straight arrows, and they are really, really good at what they do. And what we learn, and again, through Beverly Gage's new biography of J. Edgar Hoover, Tim Weiner's Enemies that came out a few years ago, and where Louis Freeh, he says J. Edgar Hoover was terrible, and he's by far from the worst FBI director of all time. It's really Louis Freeh. Is there?
Well, it's how you measure terrible. I know what you're talking about with Weiner, but it's a little bit of a
I'm just saying, what are the accumulations? And is it scandal? Is it cultural production? Is it serious people in Congress? Because there is a group of right wing, or people on the right. Some of them are libertarians who are actually principled and not just partisan hacks. People on the left who are like, what the hell is going on? Like, our intelligence agencies, not only they fail to protect us, but then they are constantly breaking the law as well. So that, what has to happen to trigger a real serious set of reforms?
Well, I think one thing that needs to happen is that there needs to be kind of, and I have mixed feelings about it because I'm center right in my overall politics, but there needs to be some sort of like revolution in the Democratic Party. I mean, I think it's an anomaly that only can happen right now, where because Trump's the leader of the Republicans, then it means that you can have a cast of people at the top of the Democratic Party, and I'm including Joe Biden, but not just Biden, but people like Adam Schiff, or it's now like the sort of leadership of the Democratic Party. They're censors. They love the FBI and the national security state. And they seem to have no compunction about turning these things against their political adversaries, whether it's social media companies through pressure from Congress, or by claiming that everybody who has I mean, listen, I don't question the validity of the 2020 election, but if there are Americans who might have questions about it because it was an unusual year in the middle of a pandemic and there were all these new procedures, that doesn't make them a so-called insurrectionist or a Russian agent. And anyway, these attitudes at the top of the Democratic Party, and I have lots of problems with the Republican Party and lots of problems with Trump, and we can talk about that too. Those people need to be ousted from their positions of power. They need to, and there is a struggle. There can be other people. People like Ro Khanna are aware of some of the free speech problems, and he needs to be strengthened, even though I'm sure I will have huge disagreements with Ro Khanna when it comes to the regulatory state or foreign policy. I'm acknowledging that I don't agree with a lot of the other more progressive wing of the Democrats, but I would rather them at this point than this nanny state censorship crew that are just a bunch of hypocrites and obsessed with this idea of disinformation, which is so arrogant, and it's so anti-democratic to think that Americans are incapable of judging information on their own, and so it's like their minds are gonna be poisoned or something like that, whereas these people's minds appear to be poisoned by this lunatic collusion conspiracy. So it's very frustrating, and I think those people really need to go. And then you'll see it's like a tipping point. I mean, if there's a tipping point where
is there a gerontocracy problem here as well?
I think there is.
I'm curious because when you think
of
Biden and you think of Dianne Feinstein and you think of many of the older people in Congress, and we're talking very old, but they have a different, they forgot the lessons of the 70s, really.
They did. They clearly, and it's ironic because
they lived during that, and some of them were
an interesting case, right?
Yeah,
because she was the victim of domestic terrorism.
Yeah,
and she becomes the mayor of San Francisco because of the assassination of Harvey Milk, I guess, right? Or
no, of Moscone.
Right. Exactly.
Moscone.
Right.
Yeah.
So, so she was always like a hawkish Democrat in the middle, but Biden was in the Senate for the Church Committee, and Biden, and by the way, the Democratic Party under George W. Bush, it's not that long ago, were raising questions about warrantless surveillance and the NSA and stellar wind program and.
But then you had the flip under Obama, right? Where Obama, I mean, partly gets elected by saying, I'm going to have the most transparent administration. We're not going to illegally surveil people. And then when Edward Snowden is like, hey, what about all this stuff? Obama's response, which was politically brilliant, he was like, I am really interested in having a conversation about unwarranted, or illegal surveillance, the ubiquity of all of this stuff. But he didn't act that way. And it kind of it seemed to have hardened liberals. I don't think progressives, but liberals to be like, oh, you know what? The deep state is what kept us from having Donald Trump, as president or something. So,
well, I mean, right. But
yeah, I mean, but just in the last couple of minutes, we're going to stop. But I guess, can we talk a little bit about how the decline in trust and authority in institutions generally, in political institutions in particular. I'm just looking at Gallup in 1975. They have a general index of trust and confidence in major institutions in America. It was at 48% of people had a great deal or a good deal of confidence and trust in institutions. It's down to 27% now. This is amazing to me. In 1975, Gallup, 52% of Americans had a great deal or a good deal of trust and confidence in the presidency as an institution. It is now at 23%. So, the recognition that the FBI and kind of the broader intelligence community and law enforcement community in America is not what it seems to be, is part of I'll say two things about it. One is that it's a concession to reality. Everything that we learn about this, it's like, yeah, we shouldn't have as much confidence and trust in these things. And it's also, that what's going on with the FBI, and I think what comes out of the Durham report and everything is part and parcel of a larger downward trend for the past 50 or 60 years. How do we, you've talked a little bit about how the FBI, like how we might change that around, et cetera. Like, how do we build back these trust and confidence in institutions so that we are not becoming, weirdly, again, given that the way discussions of Russia influence all of this, but that we don't become the kind of low trust society that Russia is, which then, it doesn't mean people give up on government and stop funding it. It really means that governments can get away with anything because people are expecting the worst.
Well, that's certainly true. I mean, one thing I would say is that, at the time, I don't think we noticed it, but, Obama used to say had this catchphrase that he used to call it the false choice between liberty and security, or freedom and security. It's not a false choice. And maybe one way to begin to restore trust is for government leaders to simply say this: if you want us to protect you from every possible terrorist attack, then you're going to have to accept that some of your privacy and some of your rights that you sort of take for granted are going to be infringed upon, and that we are going to have a sort of panopticon monitor state if you need us to protect and prevent every terrorist attack or something like that. If you think that it's more important to live with some separation, and you don't want the government to be that powerful, I think I would be on that side. Then you have to accept that there's going to be some risk and some bad things are going to happen, and it's not the fault of our government. It's because we made a conscious choice that we do not want the kind of awesome power that would be required to prevent future terrorist attacks. So that's one area where I do think after 9/11, there was something that happened where we just sort of the American people just sort of said, no, like, no more, not again. And I understand that after 9/11, I lived through it. But the implication of that was this huge expansion of the national security state and empowering the FBI to do all kinds of things. Now, first, it was against the Muslim community in America. And we didn't really sadly, we weren't as attuned to that there were American citizens who clearly had their rights, violated in a lot of the way that the FBI approached this sort of approach to preventing, future terrorist attacks. But now we're seeing that same approach is done against domestic extremists on the right and other people like that. And when you start looking at it, you're like, wait a second, why is the SWAT team going to some guy's house because he's a pro-life activist or something like that? And that happens. And can the FBI get away with this sort of thing? And if you're upset about that, and I would hope a lot of Americans are upset about that, then we should be realistic about it and say, all right, well, wait, it's unrealistic to expect our government to prevent all of these kinds of attacks. We're going to have to live with a level of risk.
Zach, final thought?
Yeah.
Or a question for Eli?
Yeah, and I know I'm also on that side of the equation. If those are the two choices, I'll take a little bit.
You're objectively pro-terrorism. That's what I'm getting.
But I wonder, as this is kind of like the closing of a chapter or something. Like we've had the Mueller report, the the Durham report, and that it feels like kind of like the final government's word on this, at least. But
you're forgetting something, Jack.
What's that?
When they finally declassify the 5% of the Mueller report, which is still remains classified,
then
then we're going to have proof of collusion.
Yeah.
And the this marshal of the Supreme Court will follow the execution orders for Steve Bannon and all these other,
Well, so that's kind of like the point I want to get at, is that there's always going to be this sort of, remainder, I guess, that still like holds on to it. And you mentioned earlier, like, you're never going to convince David Frum that the Russiagate is more or less like a made up thing. But given that belief is still just going to linger out there, what are the lasting effects of the Russiagate narrative on our politics and our culture and society?
Well, for one, I think it's like a little bit of a temporary lifeline to the FBI, which should be reeling from scandal right now. But it won't be reeling from scandal because the leadership of one of our major parties that controls the presidency will defend it precisely because it's, the other side that is so exercised about it. So the sort of, I don't know, the lingering of this disinformation has the effect of blunting and stopping reform. And I think the other thing is that it further just I think it kind of further just intensifies the distrust between citizens and between our political parties. And it makes it really difficult to be in the place where I am, and I imagine the two of you are, which is that I don't like Trump. I think Trump's a dangerous demagogue. I think there's a lot of bad things about him.
Yeah.
But I also don't like these abuses that have been uncovered about the FBI. And so if in order to, it's like I don't feel like I need to choose between those two things. I can have both of those positions. But for a lot of Americans and the loudest voices in our discourse, you have to choose between the two. And so that's a huge problem, in that I think it really kind of stupefies us. It makes us dumber. And I wish it wasn't the case, but that's where we are.
All right. Well, we are going to leave it there. That's where we are at the Reason live stream, which please come back next Thursday at 1 p.m. Eastern time. We have been talking with Eli Lake, whose brilliant podcast, The Reeducation, is available every. I tend to listen to it on Spotify, but it's on Apple, it's et cetera. You also write regularly for commentary. You just had a big piece in the Free Press, New York Sun.
Free Press. Yeah.
So you just Google Eli Lake and put safe search on. You had that brief period, both performer. But read the articles. Don't look at the pictures for Eli Lake.
Free
Eli,
John Sinclair. Okay.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Wonderful talking to you. And
thank you.
Really appreciate the work that you're doing. Zach Weissmueller, as always, we will be here next week, next Thursday. Zach, what are you working on? Just to give people a taste. Zach has emerged over the past decade, really, but certainly over the past few years as the documentarian in chief, I think, of Reason TV. You did a couple of weeks ago, you did a great piece about homelessness in San Francisco versus Texas, or California versus Texas, which is brilliant. 250,000 views, deserves twice as much as that. What are you working on these days?
Thanks. And yeah, that was a collaboration with Liz Wolfe, and there's a lot of great documentaries coming out from many people on the platform. What we most recently, our most recent trip was to Miami, where the latest Bitcoin conference was taking place. Yep. And so we're going to give a kind of like, what is Bitcoin at this point? Like, what does it mean? What is this, the culture that has emerged around it? I think it's going to be a really interesting piece. And I'll also just take a moment to promote a documentary we made earlier this year about a Supreme Court case that was just decided today pertaining to the EPA and the way that it regulates waterways. That is a very important decision that just came out, and we have an in-depth documentary about that case, which has been going on for over a decade at this point. So those are what I would point to people to.
Okay, and then I'm just going to make a quick plug for myself for Reason in New York City. If you live in New York City, on Monday, June 5th, a week and a half, we're doing a live taping of the Reason Interview podcast in Midtown at the Blue Building, which is the coolest building in Manhattan on a bizarre block that's just down the streets from a famous steakhouse where a famous mobster was rubbed out. It is unlike any place you've ever seen in Manhattan, but I'm interviewing Kat Timpf, the Fox News contributor, Gutfeld regular, who has a great new book out called You Can't Joke About That. Go to reason.com/events to see what we're doing. We're popping up all over the place. And if you like what we do online, it's even better in person. But thank you again, Eli Lake of the Reeducation, Zach Weissmueller of Reason, and I'm Nick Gillespie. We'll see you next week.